Good afternoon, folks, or good morning, wherever you may be. We're going to be starting our webinar today in about a minute. We still have folks signing on, so we want to make sure everybody's on board, has their lunch or their coffee or whatever with them. So we're going to give it one more minute or so, then we'll get started. So I'll be back to talk to you just in a little bit. Okay, well, good morning again, or good afternoon again, depending where you are. Welcome to today's webinar. This is a reprise of our Looking Over the Horizon webinar that we did last Tuesday. We had a lot of interest, so we're doing it twice. And today we're going to go over we're going to go over all the same things we discussed before, and maybe have a little bit of update given the past week. So the things that I want to cover today would include postal finances and some price change basics, just to give a level set to everyone who may or may not be totally up to speed on such issues. Then we'll talk about the price change itself, PRC actions, and some things that are, in fact, over the horizon. So the first thing we want to do is just talk about Postal Service's financial situation, which, of course, directly impacts and is impacted by any price change. And the figures you see here are through the end of August. Now, the Postal Service's fiscal year ended at the end of September, and we are now in fiscal 2020, but given the nature of postal accounting and all the auditing they have to do, they don't have their end of the year or end of quarter four or September figures yet. I would expect them to be released sometime early next month after the auditors are finished with them and the governors have reviewed them and so forth. But this gives you a pretty good idea, even looking at August, as to how the year is going to turn out. As you can see, revenue for the year was a little bit below plan at the end of August, but it was ahead of the previous year, of course, because there had been a price change 10 months ago or 9 months ago in January. Expenses are where the problem is. They're ahead of plan, and they're substantially ahead of last year. Much of this, of course, is because of such things as transportation costs, which is a, quote, controllable, unquote, cost in the mind of the Postal Service. But there are other things that they can't control. And one example is the workers' comp adjustment, which is actually only a paper adjustment. There's no money changing hands, but it still affects the balance sheet. And there was a 2-month period, I think it was either July to August or June to July, when month over month, the valuation of the workers' comp liability had a swing of over $1 billion. And that's, of course, because of interest rates and how those, as they go up, the liability goes down and vice versa. Even so, right now, as far as the accountants go, the loss for the year is $8.2 billion at the end of August, which was more than twice what it was a year earlier. Volume, of course, is a major contributor to, or the lack of volume, I guess, is a major contributor to the Postal Service's financial problems. It was below plan at the end of August and well below last year. First class, as you can see, is down over 3%. Most of that coming from single piece first class, which is the mail that you and I don't send anymore. The cards and letters we don't send, the bill payments we don't send, and that, of course, was their most lucrative form of mail, of market dominant mail, I should say. Standard mail close to 70 billion pieces, but even that's down. Standard mail, of course, is very seasonal, I guess is the correct word, and it also is benefited by elections. So if we have an election, marketing mail jumps way up for that month or two period, and then it goes back to a more normal level thereafter. Periodicals, as you can see, is continuing to struggle, down over 7%. There have been some months it's down by well over 10%. And shipping and package services is priority mail, express mail, package, parcel select, such things as that. But that 0.8% supply really is a worrisome figure, because for several years, shipping and package services has been the absolute salvation of the Postal Service's finances because of the money it brings in and how much that helps offset postal costs. The trouble is, major e-commerce shippers giveth and they taketh away. And at this point, you've got their biggest customer, Amazon, going into delivering their own pieces. And items that were being provided to UPS that were given in turn to the Postal Service for last mile delivery. In both cases, you've got the carrier kicking things back because now density is sufficient to warrant having their own people deliver the items. So now what used to go to the Postal Service for last mile from UPS, for example, or from FedEx, or what was being given to the Postal Service by Amazon, those are being held back now for delivery by the respective companies. So as you can see, the trends, which aren't going to end at the end of August, or didn't and won't be ending anytime soon, are continuing diversion, especially first class, fixed costs, which just don't go away. It's still the same processing network, still the same 34,000 post offices, still a growing delivery network of 155 plus million delivery points, to which the Postal Service is required to go 6 days a week at least. And of course, as we mentioned before, the weakening growth of competitive products. So that's the background against which all this is happening. Now, the financial plan shows you, again, a really snapshot view of what the Postal Service expected and what it's seeing as results for 2019. It may come out with its revenue, but it's not going to make that net loss figure. It's going to go well past that, I think. Volume, that's a little worrisome, because you can see they expected to get about 144 billion pieces, and now we're not even up to 126 yet. So we'll see how this turns out. We should be seeing the 2020 figures, as I said, 2019 year-end figures, sometime probably early in November, and then we can see how close they came in their estimate for the fiscal year just concluded. Now, about the price change. Okay, anybody who's been around for as long as I have, I guess, remembers the old system by which you had a cost of service rate making process. The Postal Service would go in and say, it's going to cost us this much to do what we got to do. Here we spread it all around to the different products. Of course, they weren't market dominant and competitive back then. But it was an adversarial piece of litigation before what was called at that time the Postal Rate Commission. And they would argue about, first class should get a raise in price and not standard, and standard mailers would say, no, raise first class, not us, and so forth. All that went away in 2006. Now we have a different pricing strategy, divided products into market dominant and competitive, and there are requirements for how much notice needs to be given to customers about the prices going up. In both types of mail, the minimum notice now is considerably more than what the law requires. And you can see, I guess you probably had plenty of experience of this over the past 13 years, but market dominant products are the traditional classes of mail, first class, standard, periodicals, package services, and some special services, and those are capped at a CPI, cost of a CPI based on what the Department of Labor gives out. We'll talk about that in a minute. And those proposals must be approved by the PRC. So right now, the PRC is reviewing the current price filing. Competitive products are a different creature. Those are the things that have obvious, visible competition in the marketplace. Those prices aren't capped, and those are set by the governors of the Postal Service. So right now, those prices are as official as they're going to be, and what the PRC is doing is just looking at various statutory considerations to make sure they've been met. We'll cover that a little bit more in a few minutes as well. Now, the CPI, this is your math exercise for the day. The Consumer Price Index, which, as I said, is set by the Department of Labor, comes out every month, around the middle of the month. And this chart shows you, the top chart shows you a rolling 12-month average as of the month that's indicated. So that arrow toward the middle shows where things were in August of 2018. And at that point, the cap, which was used for rate filings, was almost 2.4%. The cap that was used recently was 1.9%. So the bottom graph shows you how the cost of living changes, how the calculated cap, rather, how that changes over time. And as you can see, it's been changing disfavorably to the Postal Service for about the past year. In fact, it fell to almost 0.8% less than what it was a year ago, losing 0.5 point year over year. So that's something which you may look at as a ratepayer and say, well, that's good news. I'm not going to have prices go up as much. People will probably be more inclined to stay in the mail. But the bad news is the Postal Service's costs don't go away. It still has to maintain its network, pay its employees, deliver the mail, move the mail, and none of that's getting any cheaper. So there's an obvious, I guess, price squeeze or money squeeze here being generated because the Postal Service's rate authority, and this is its rate authority for many of its products, is limited by the cost of living for consumers. Now, you're a consumer, I'm a consumer, and our cost experience is reflected in this figure. But is it necessarily the cost experience of the Postal Service? We don't have the same transportation cost or no labor cost, heaven knows. So there's always been a running debate as to whether or not the CPI is the appropriate figure to use. Not whether there should be some sort of control or cap on postage rates, just whether or not the CPI is the correct tool to use to reflect postal costs and how those should be kept in check by good management. So anyways, here's where the CPI came from. So this establishes the Postal Service's rate authority. Rate authority is a term of art that's used in this. So, and the rate authority comes from the CPI, but it isn't necessarily just a current year figure. As you can see on the chart there, the Postal Service keeps a little bit of its authority from a previous case, and that is banked. And they can bank it for a certain number of years, and then use it if they don't have a very big cap in a succeeding year. So this time, as you can see, although the cap is 1.9, some of the classes of mail had a little bit of authority left over for them to use. And even though they used most of it, there is some left over again. Periodicals is the exception here because they are so far underwater that there's no reason to not use every bit of rate authority, but that may not even be much help because they're so far down. In other situations, you've got a small amount of authority left. How much good that'll do, we'll see next time. Here's the price change at a very high level. The average is 1.9%, but you can see again, some of those were a little bit more, a little bit less because of the use of that banked authority for first class, for example, or what they chose not to use and put back into the bank. So within these class level changes, you've got a lot of variation amongst categories and amongst price cells, as you will see as we go through them in more detail. How the Postal Service figures all this out is based upon a volume-weighted calculation. So that if you've got a relatively low volume type of mail, a rate cell or a rate category that doesn't get much business, that can be increased well above the class average, but not make much of an impact on cap compliance because there's so little volume. On the other hand, if you change a high volume category by a little bit, that can have a very significant impact on how well the class complies with the cap. And all this is done behind the scenes in the process of figuring out how to change things from a current rate set to the proposed rate set. Now, in all cases, of course, rates must cover their costs. Obviously, there are situations in which they don't. We'll talk about those as we go along here. On the other hand, for work sharing situations, especially, which is automation, pre-sort, and destination entry, barring a really good reason, and the law gives the Postal Service a set of valid reasons, the compensation cannot be more than the value of the work saved. So if the type of work sharing involved saves the Postal Service a penny, and it passes through a penny discount, that's what they call a 100% pass-through. If they pass back a half a penny, it's a 50% pass-through. They give you a penny and a half or 2 cents, it's 150 or 200% pass-through. And those are the ones that are problematic because you're getting more of a discount than what you're really earning. And that is something which has drawn the attention of the PRC. We'll talk about that too. So a decision is expected by the middle of next month, and barring any problems, we'll see things implemented 26th of January, 11:59 or 12:01 a.m. on the 20th in 2020. So here's first class. Again, the class average is one thing, and we talked about how things vary within the class. Single piece is actually going down a little bit. The stamp price, which is the vast majority of single piece, is not changing, but you've got a small change for QBRM. We'll see that in a moment. Pre-sort letters and cards is going up by a little bit more than the average, but again, it's a weighted average, so they can do that and stay within the cap. Flats, always a problem for the Postal Service, are going up by a lot, but looking at last year's changes, it really kind of averages out over time. And then, of course, you've got a couple of international classes that are relatively low volume, and those are being adjusted significantly. So the stamp's the same as it was, and the flat increase, as I said, is, again, cost coverage. So let's look at some of the single piece rates. No change for most of it. The non-metered rates, the non-machinable rates, rather, residual rates aren't changing. QBRM is what went down. Now, this thing about Carlson, and this is a wrinkle that I don't really know how it's going to work out, nor does anybody else at this point. Mr. Carlson is a non-practicing attorney in San Francisco and a bit of a postal gadfly. So last year, he looked at the decision the Postal Regulatory Commission made about the price of a stamp, and decided that the explanation it gave for raising it to 55 cents wasn't good enough. So he sued, and lo and behold, the appeals court agreed with him and said that the commission didn't actually do a good job of explaining itself. So it's going to have to do so, and it vacated the order, that portion of the order for 2019 rates that had to do with single piece first class. But then the court immediately said, we're going to hold off on that to see what happens here. So in this case, in filing its current case, the Postal Service said, while the court has not yet actually implemented this decision, it might make more sense just to let us handle everything here in this one case, and then hopefully set everything aside, satisfy the court, move on to 55 cents, and be done with it. We'll see. But that's a background issue that's really going to be more of an annoyance than anything else for most people, and of little consequence probably for commercial mailers. Now, oops, here we go. Now, I told you about the change to other things. Flats went up by a lot. And these are all things that have been done to improve cost coverage, and oddly enough, to reverse reductions that were in 2018 that took effect this year. So if you took both of them, if you took the 2019 rates and the 2020 proposals and compared that to where you were 2 years ago, you might see that things have not changed all that much in a linear sense, but it's been kind of a whipsaw to go from 17 to 18, 18 to 19, 19 to 20. Again, now we got to make sure things don't go under cost coverage. Here are the price changes for I shouldn't say the price changes. Here's the percentage of price change for the pre-sorted types of first class. Now, last year, these were mostly green. You had relatively small changes in the pre-sort rates or the flats rates, or actual decreases in some situations, because the price of the stamp went up by a nickel. Now remember, we're working under the cap. You have to make sure that your total additional increase for the class does not exceed that cap level. So when they raised the price of a stamp, they had to then mitigate any changes elsewhere. So that's why, as the Postal Service argues, look at these things over more than 1 year, and you'll see that it makes a little more sense. Just the same, if you're the ratepayer in 2020, you're going to have a bit of a shock when you're sending out higher weight pre-sorted flats and seeing that the price is 10 to 15 to 20% higher or more. Now, the actual price of a letter size piece, of an automation letter size piece, is going up kind of within the range of the overall rate change, although the less finely pre-sorted types, mixed AADC, are seeing a higher increase. Now, you may wonder, why do you have 5-digit going up more than AADC? In some situations, what's done is the rates have to be made logical to one another. And this is something which you have to kind of look at over not a multi-year, but also a multi-rate view to make sure that what is being proposed or being approved not only covers cost, but makes sense. So that if you give a discount that's too big or too small, it's one issue. If you give a discount that is not logical compared to adjacent rates, that's another issue as well. So that explains some of these unusual changes in some situations. Looking at at how things changed in 2018 compared to 2019, this is what we're just talking about. You can see that in 2018, you had significant reductions in the flat prices, and this year you've got significant increases in the flat prices. So overall, if you compare the numbers together, the net change year over year probably is relatively small in many cases, and the same holds true for the pre-sorted letters. Looking at what happened last year, or actually, I guess 2019, effective 2019, and what's proposed to happen in 2020, you can see that given the fact that the price cap was 2.4 last year and it's 1.9 now, that maybe over the course of the 2 years, the two increases actually net out to being a reasonable figure, looking at them compared to the cap. But this is what the Postal Service is arguing, saying, look at this over a multiple year period, and things don't look quite so ridiculous. Well, we'll see. Now, marketing mail. A lot of these same principles apply here. The class average was just under 1.9%, but letters and flats and other components changed at different amounts. Now, letter size, for the most part, came out pretty well off. It got a decent change in some situations. Flats and parcels had to go up because of cost coverage. And again, rate relationships are something which has to be monitored as well. And you've had a much more complex matrix in marketing mail prices than you do in first class. Of course, nonprofit rates are set by law at about 60% of commercial prices. So that's why you can look across and see sometimes how those prices are following the same trends as the commercial rates. And here is a look at some of the things that are changing for commercial rate, commercial and nonprofit rate letters. You've got some significant increases down there in the circles, and part of that is because of requirements by the PRC to change the pass-through. Every year, the Postal Service files what's called an annual compliance report. And then the PRC looks at that and issues what they call an annual compliance determination. So it's my term paper and the teacher's review of my term paper. And every year the PRC tells the Postal Service to fix its underwater rates and fix the excessive pass-throughs. And it's given them some specific targets and requirements, which, as you can see, are now being manifest in the price changes proposed by the Postal Service. So even though in some cases, you wonder why they're jacking up 5-digit by 7.5% or whatever, or 9%. In some cases, it's because they have to pare back the pass-through that had been afforded mailers in the past. So I guess you could say that we were getting too much, and now we have to make up for it. But in other cases, you can see how the prices are changing very little, or in at least one cell going down. So comparing this again to what we saw last year, you can see that the same principle holds true in many cases. What went up last year isn't going up as much this year, or what went up a lot this year went up less last year. Again, looking at all of these things year over year, bearing in mind the 2 points that there has to be a logical relationship between the various discounts, the various prices, and in some cases they have to make up what they've been excessively passing through for some types of pre-sort. And you can see in each situation how an individual mailer's experience or ratepayer's experience may vary because of how that individual entity's mailings may be configured. Do you have a lot of carrier route? Do you have a lot of saturation? Are you under 3.5 ounces? Are you over 3.5 ounces? What's your level of destination entry, and so forth? So that's the letters. Looking at some of the heavier pieces, the flats, same idea. We've got rates for some going up well over CPI, and rates for others being left substantially alone. High density and saturation have a very little, if any, price increase. Again, reflecting how costs are passed through, reflecting how past price increases impacted these types of mail. And you can see that here, a lot of the pass-throughs have been cut back, especially for the pre-sort levels. Like, for example, there's a 13% increase and a 23% increase on the lower right there for some of the nonprofit pieces that are being, their pound rates, piece rates, because of how past increases did not adequately provide cost coverage or reflected an excessive pass-through. So here's comparing again last year, 2018 into 2019, and 2019 into 2020, and you'll see the same pattern of you talked about before coming through, where some rates are being changed differently now than they were last year because of how much they went up or didn't go up last year. Again, we see things being raised above CPI because of excessive pass-throughs or cost coverage issues. Now, these are the lighter weight flats. So flats, of course, have had a terrible cost experience in the past few years, and there's a lot of reasons to offer for that, including problems with the flat sorters, the FSS, manual sortation costs going up, a variety of things. But flats have had a terrible price experience the past few years. And this talks about flats that are heavier, comparing how those have changed. Same story. You can see some prices that went up last year didn't go up this year, and vice versa. But again, looking at some things toward the bottom, the bottom of the chart there, you can see some things are really taking it in the neck. If you've had to catch up on previous discounts or previous work sharing initiatives that rewarded too much, or simply to catch up on cost coverage problems. And all of this is based upon cost data that the Postal Service is required to collect at a granular level, not just what it costs for the carrier to deliver it, but processing costs, and attributing all these things into the different types of mail that you can see reflected on the chart. Now, a couple other things you've got to keep in mind. For the first time, the Postal Service is charging a different price for two flavors, if you will, of DAL. The traditional DAL with no ads had a 12.5% increase, up half a cent. But what they call detached marketing labels that do have paid advertising on them had a 20% increase, up a whole penny. The differentiation had been put in place back in 2012, but this is the first time they've chosen to actually act on it and use it to have different prices. The thinking being, well, this is something which is of value to the mailer, therefore they should pay more for it. That's their thinking. So overall, you've got flats costs that are really being pushed as a driver for those over CPI increases we saw, and of course, as we talked about, some increases reflect the PRC's instructions to bring those pass-throughs down to 100%. Now, and believe it or not, some discounts have actually been, some changes have actually been put in place that were less than what the PRC would have wanted, just to avoid rate shock. Even though you saw some cells have double-digit increases and some over 20%, there were others where it could have been, I guess those and others could have been a lot worse had the full adjustment to 100% pass-through been put into force this time. And again, same idea, look at the rate changes over the course of more than 1 year to get an idea what's going on here. The Postal Service is forever trying to tweak its rates to send the right price signals. You should be pre-sorting to this level. You should be going to automation. You should not be preparing residual. You should be using, in the case of periodicals, more palletization. Or you should not be preparing flats, or you should be very lighter flats, or using destination entry. All of these things are price signals being sent to the mailing community about what's the more efficient form of preparation that the Postal Service wants you to do. But at the same time, of course, they're juggling all these other adjustments because of pass-through, because of flats costs, and so forth. So there are a lot of moving parts behind what you see here, and it's not just pull a number out of a hat. Periodicals, of course, the outside county where the majority of the rate, the majority of the volume is, went up a little bit more than CPI, but we're not going to live long enough to see periodicals have full cost coverage. They're 20% under full cost coverage. So they've raised these as much as possible, and they try to adjust all their work share pass-throughs. And if you look at the very complicated rate chart for periodicals, you can see how some changed a little more drastically than others. Again, for the same reasons we talked about for the other classes of mail. But it's a lost cause yet. They're never going to cover full cost coverage for periodicals. Package services, which really is very few things anymore now. It's media mail, library mail, bound printed matter, and Alaska bypass. And it made some changes here, trying to bring some of those discounts again to equal what the costs were. And you've got media mail, library mail, still very inexpensive, but those are things that are statutorily protected too because of their perceived educational, cultural, scientific, and informational value. Bound printed matter, an increase about or a little bit above the CPI cap on the class. Flats again because of the problems we've talked about many times in the past here. And a few special services. These are all the various services that many are retail, some are for businesses, from P.O. boxes to customized postage and so forth. Again, these are capped as a group to as if they were a class, but within that class, of course, you've got a variety of different rate changes, and this is just a snapshot of a few of them. Tracking for marketing mail parcels, for example, was cut in half. Some of the address management services went up above the class average because of the value the Postal Service believes that they're providing to mailers, and changes to P.O. box. So that's kind of a snapshot of what's happening in the special services group. Now, competitive prices, those are things that are set by the Postal Service. The governors are given some proposals. They review it, make sure everything is kosher, and then they approve those. As you can see, the prices went up in a range from just under 2% to about 4%, and oftentimes the prices for commercial classes, for commercial categories, if you will, went up less than the retail. Again, these are things that are competing directly with FedEx, UPS, DHL, and so forth. So these are things to which the Postal Service needs to be particularly sensitive, not just for cost coverage, but also for competitive positioning. People are going to have their preference and their opinions, but the Postal Service does not want to give you another excuse based on price to avoid using their services. So what's going to happen now? Well, the price changes were filed a little over 2 weeks ago, or 10 days ago rather, and the requirement for notice to mailers we talked about earlier, it's 45 days for market dominant, 30 for competitive products, but in each case, counting to January 20th, you've got 112 days. So this is enough for the Postal Service, for the PRC rather, to go through its processes and render a decision in time for everybody to get ready for it. Now, it's not just a matter of me issuing price charts or you contacting your clients. It's also a matter of all the software people getting all their software tables up to date and make sure everything works correctly there. So right now, the market dominant filing is out for comment, and comments are due on the 29th, which is next Tuesday. And then the way the law works, the PRC has time as a set amount of time to get a decision back. So if you figure 14 business days or so, however they want to count it, mid-November is when we're looking at an answer. Now, right now, what's happening is the Postal Regulatory Commission is sending questions to the Postal Service to explain some of the data that it submitted with its filing. Is this number right? Where'd you get this figure from? Explain this cost. And some are incredibly geeky. They're way in the weeds. Others are pretty straightforward. There was one, they said, did you get this number wrong? You had two different numbers in two different places. They said, yes, we got a number wrong. There's a typo. So you've got a whole range of things being questioned right now in the course of the PRC's review. But all that's got to get wrapped up in time for them to issue a decision by somewhere in mid-November. Now, as far as the competitive products goes, they're doing three things. They're looking at what the Postal Service is proposing to make sure that you've got full cost coverage, which is pretty obvious, that market dominant products aren't cross-subsidizing competitive products, which is pretty obvious, and that the competitive products are contributing what's called the appropriate share to institutional costs. The statute calls for them to contribute well below 10%, 5 to 8% towards institutional costs, and I think the last time I saw a figure, the contribution was well into the low 20% range. So there's no problem there either. So that should be reviewed and finished by mid-November as well. And if everything goes well, again, January 26th. So looking over the horizon now, this is not the whole story. A lot of other things are happening. Seamless acceptance, for example, which has been looming in the future for a long time, is going to happen. Now, we don't know when, because the Postal Service had talked about issuing a proposed rule with a calendar and a schedule in it in September. Well, it didn't happen. So whenever it happens, you're going to expect to see something along this line. You're going to expect to see seamless required for mailers with a DMU, or that enter 90% full service mail at a BMEU. And then there's going to be a parallel deadline, well, not necessarily March, could be April or May at this point, with full transition by early 2021, and then end of manual verifications by July of that year. Now, the end of manual verification means, obviously, fewer people being involved, fewer postal people being involved, no more Merlin, please hold your applause, and an end of many of the arguments that tend to manual verification. So verification of the 20th century, and it's going to be done based upon more of a census observation of the mailing and the risk, the term for it, and how much of a risk a mailer's past performance shows it to be. So if you have your stuff together, you do a good job, you don't have a lot of errors, month over month, year over year, you have very few problems showing up in your scorecard, then you probably see very little other manual intervention. But whatever the proposed rule is, it's going to come out for a 30-day comment period rather. So when that comes out, please look it over. We'll publish it in the newsletter for you to look at and offer us your comments. You've also got this other thing hanging out there in the air, which has all sorts of ramifications. 10 years after the PRC or the PAEA, the law was passed, the PRC was required to examine the process and see whether it worked to support the statutory objectives. So one of those objectives was that the Postal Service is maintaining financial stability. Now, if you had not had the $55.8 billion pre-funding requirement tacked on to the law at the last minute, the PRC could have found, yeah, it works great, no problems. However, the year-long review that it conducted, this is going back now almost 2 years, ended up showing what we all could figure out, that the rate-setting process could not provide enough revenue to make that gigantic payment every year and still keep the lights on. So working within the narrow confines of their assignment, they said, well, in order to fix the rate-setting process, you got to do some of the things that you can show right there. Significant increases over the CPI, primarily. So obviously that just caused a firestorm of reaction. There was a lot of opposition to it. There are some who questioned whether the PRC had the authority to even do that. And so at the end of all of this, almost 2 years ago now, almost 2 years ago, it came to a halt. So we haven't seen the final rule. We haven't even seen the revised proposed rule. I think the PRC continues to light candles, hoping that Congress does something. But we all know that no matter how many candles you light, Congress is not going to get off the dime and do anything. They're too busy arguing. So the prospect of Postal Reform 2 being some sort of solution and salvation for this problem, we can just hope happens. But in the meantime, this is still hanging out there. And depending on what happens, it could have a big consequence on postage rates. Litigation, of course, we talked about the whole thing with Mr. Carlson over here. We said that the increase wasn't justified in his opinion. It wasn't properly supported by what the court called reasoned decision making. So it vacated that part of the rule, sent it back to the PRC essentially. So right now, as I said, there's no particular next step at this point. Everybody's kind of waiting to see what will the Department of Justice sue or ask for a further rehearing by all the judges of the appeals court. Will the Postal Service and the PRC work it out in this rate case? Who knows? But it is something else which is hanging out there to be resolved. Now, we have other things that are going on. We have, well, first of all, we have a PMG who's leaving at the end of January. She will have finished her 5-year contract as she promised. So February 1st, there's going to be a new PMG. Okay, we don't know who that's going to be, of course. They're searching. They're probably searching inside, searching outside to find somebody who's going to be good for it. But here's the problem. Only the governors can appoint the PMG. Right now, as we speak, we have 5 governors. But one of those governors is in his grace year, and the grace year is the 1 year that you're allowed to stay in your seat after the official end of your term. Well, that person, the chairman of the board, as a matter of fact, Robert Duncan, his grace year ends December 8th. So if we're going to have 5 governors in place, which would be a quorum, to take action on this new person and make that new person the PMG, they don't have a whole lot of time before they went into having a quorum problem. Now, for years, of course, for over, I think it was like 14 months, in fact, so 16 months, there were no governors because of senatorial inaction on nominations. Nobody confirmed them. We've got 5 now, but unless we have some more nominations, unless the Senate can find time in its busy calendar of arguments to do something, we're going to be back in the same problem we had before, too few governors to do some of the important things that have to get done. In other webinars, we talked about sales and use tax laws and privacy laws, both of which are in flux now because of court actions, both of which could be significant problems for commercial mailers, printers who mail, printers who just send stuff. So you have to keep track of those things. We're doing our best to keep you informed based on what we can find out. Of course, we have international rate, big changes there. The Postal Service, the U.S. is not pulling out of the Universal Postal Union, as it had threatened to do. It sort of got its way. And next July 1st, the U.S. and many countries will begin imposing self-declared rates on international mail. So the things that the president was concerned about coming from China and paying too little postage will now be charged more postage, perhaps appropriately so, because that will cover their costs. You've also got changes coming to postal costs under labor agreements. There are 2 unions right now are settled. 2 are settled. 2 are in this makes too many. The clerks union is in arbitration. The rural carriers settled, and the city carriers and the mail handlers are still in negotiations. Obviously, labor being the huge portion of the Postal Service's costs. As those change, so will what has to be paid, what has to be collected to pay for those costs in terms of rates. We talked about the loss of parcel revenue. This is not going to be something which is going to be good for the bottom line because there's no other source of revenue. You can't just simply force people to mail more letters and flats. And so loss of parcel volume and revenue will be a serious problem. And of course, will Congress act on reform? Well, we can all hope, but I wouldn't hold my breath. So that kind of sums up everything that we're looking at. And you know, if you have any questions here, I would be happy to answer them. We've got the handout from today's slides, of course, is available. You can see it there. It's a PDF that's available for you to download, for you to review. I will caution you on this. If you do download it, like many things, it has a shelf life. So the information in that may go stale, could change, become inapplicable at a certain point. And of course, the rates that we showed are rates that were based on the filing. And if the rates that come back from the Rate Commission or the Regulatory Commission are not in line with what was proposed, then you're going to have some differences there, and you would be incorrect if you still based whatever you talk to your customers about with working with that. I see a question here. Let's see. Let me see what this says. Okay, first question: will the Douglas Carlson fight to overturn the 55-cent price to mail a 1-ounce stamp letter affect this price change? Well, I don't know. We talked about that a minute ago, and if the court is satisfied with how this is done, yes, it'll just be a non-issue. But again, there are many variables here. First being, will the Department of Justice, who represents the PRC, will they file for a further appeal hearing? Will the PRC do what it's supposed to do a better job in explaining its original decision and further justify it again this year? Well, I don't think that would be a bit of rocket science, but they probably will do that. Again, will that satisfy the court? Will that satisfy Carlson, who likes to just hear himself talk? I don't know. We have to wait and see. Let's see. Realistically, how much additional cost reduction is available to USPS by mandating seamless? Does USPS know how many mailers the DMUs are yet to implement seamless, and have they correlated that to labor savings? If I know them, they took the cost savings years ago when they assumed everyone's going to move over to it and they could get rid of clerks and BMEUs. At this point, how much additional is left? You could figure the work hours that are being spent at DMUs, work hours being spent at BMEUs to accept mail from current or potentially seamless mailers. So I'm sure they have a figure someplace, at least an estimate about what they will be saving. I'm sure they do know who's on seamless. They do know who could be or should be. So they do have an idea about how many more need to move over or could move over, and then translating that into mail volume, how many mailings they submit, and so forth. So they do have some level of knowledge about what's left to be taken in this case, what savings are left to be taken. Let's see. With the new members of the PRC, any thoughts on their mindset, such as periodicals are so far underwater? Well, I don't think there's any disagreement any place about what could be done or should be done. Obviously, everybody else is paying for the shortfall in periodicals. So, having said that, everybody understands, too, the cap is in place. So there's no provision in the law to say you can break the cap in order to fix the significant level of cost coverage shortfall that periodicals have. So whether they like to do it or not, I don't think that there's no statutory permission for them to use to do that. The two new members of the commission, I can't think of one of them. Ann Fisher is one. She was on the commission worked for the commission for years. She's very familiar with this. So I don't think there's anybody who really has a magic answer here, short of congressional action, to allow recovery of all that shortfall. But of course, bear in mind, if you did all of a sudden begin to ratchet up periodicals rates to bring them someplace within earshot of full cost coverage, that might be very harmful to publications, because right now they're already struggling. They can't sell ad space because they're losing volume to online versions of themselves. So it would be one of those things where, yes, we can fix one problem, we'll cause an even bigger one someplace else. So you got to watch out what you wish for. Promotions. Yeah, we didn't talk about promotions. There were promotions authorized. There were promotions as part of the 2020 proposal. The same promotions with very little change, if any, compared to what was offered in 2019. We had a little bit of an overview of those in the last issue of the newsletter, where we summed up the rate filing. But in general, I think it's safe to say those promotions that we had last year will be brought forward into 2020 if they're approved by the PRC. Let's see, another question. If the USPS ever makes full service seamless mandatory, will it have to be the rate case for that year, or they can do it in addition to one? Yes and no. People remembering back, about 6-7 years now, when the Postal Service wanted to make full service required for automation rates, they eventually were told they couldn't do that because at the same time they were eliminating, I think, the basic rate, the basic automation rate. So if you're going to, so this gets rather technical, if you're going to impose a requirement such as full service or seamless, and you're going to tie it to a rate, aside from the cost justification for that and all the thoughts about, well, is it the right price signal to the customer and so forth, you've also got to make sure that in doing so you don't remove a rate availability for someone who is not full service or is not seamless. So if you've got, I don't know, the local Boy Scout troop who currently is mailing at a first class rate or is giving its mail, Boy Scout troop is too small. But if you had a mailer of some level of volume who right now is taking advantage of a rate that would go away if full service became a mandatory feature of that of automation rates, then yes, that would be a rate case issue. If you're leaving all the rates in place and you're just changing the requirement for automation rates, then that is something which might be possible through a Federal Register notice and comment rulemaking. But it's a very dicey issue, and one where I'm sure if the Postal Service attempted to make it a requirement, there would be a lot of questions asked, and it may not go necessarily very smoothly, but that's something which I don't think is an unreasonable question to ask, because heaven knows they really want everyone in full service and seamless. Let's see, you're hearing about candidates for PMG, and do they stay inside the building or go out? That's a good question. The last three PMGs, Jack Potter, the last four, I should say, Bill Henderson, Jack Potter, Pat Donahoe, and Megan, of course, all four were inside. This goes back to the late 90s. Before that, going all the way back to the start of the Postal Service in 1970, 71, they were all outsiders, except for Bill Bolger. So, what can you draw from that? Well, I'd say that the first thing is the Postal Service is going to have a hard time finding somebody who wants to take on the aggravation that the job entails for the princely sum of $280,000 a year. Now, someone's going to say, oh, that's a lot of money. Yeah, I mean, to the average Joe, Jane, it is a lot of money, but stop and think. You're running a $65 billion enterprise with 635,000 employees. You've got 34,000 retail outlets and all that span of responsibility. But still, your company is significantly constrained in its ability to raise income, to open new products. And you've got the 535 smartest people in the world sitting in Capitol Hill telling you how to do your job. So if you're in a private company, a tenth the size of the Postal Service, making twice or three or four or five times what the PMG is making, you'd have to ask yourself, why the hell would I want that job? That's a fair question, because there is so much aggravation to doing this. Unless you're just devoted to public service, I don't know why anybody on the outside who has the skill set, who has the financial acumen, the organizational shrewdness, the government relations, the navigation skill, and so forth. Why, if you're that good, unless you're just looking for a chance to be a public servant, I don't know why you want to volunteer for that job. So that's why they may well, for lack of anything else, be looking inside. And I'm not trying to say the people on the inside are not good. You've got good candidates. You've got first Deputy PMG is Ron Stroman, who came from a congressional background, who doesn't have a strong operational background, though. Then you've got Joe Corbett, the CFO, who understands operations very well, who is clearly a financially smart person. You've got the COO, David Williams, not to be confused with the Governor, David Williams, who, of course, is in the position that Megan was in, that Pat was in, that Jack was in. So, I'm sure he's saying to himself, lightning may strike four times. I don't know. Whether they're going to go in or not, I don't know. But as I said, unless they can find somebody who is really interested to take on the job for the price they want to pay them, they may end up having no option but staying inside. And that's just my initial take at it. I could be totally wrong. They may find Marvin Runyon 2 someplace, in which case life would be very interesting. So anyways, that's sort of the long and the short of things. At this point, in the next issue or 2 or 3 of the newsletter, you'll be seeing how things develop. Of course, over the course of the next 2.5 months, we'll be seeing the completion of the rate setting process. Probably seeing a few other things come to pass. We'll know who our new PMG is. And at that point, there'll be a lot of things to expect next year as that individual sets a course for the Postal Service. We being a group, an association of sorts who supports commercial mailers who print, printers who mail, we provide you information on this kind of thing through our newsletter. It's supplied every 2 weeks to our subscribers. So we would invite anyone who would like to join to please check us out and think about it, because there's always information you need in order to do that part of your business better. And that would be available to you through the information down there at the bottom of this page. Just contact us. We can send you more information if you need it. I'm going to thank all of you for calling in today. I hope you got something out of it. We'll be doing more webinars. We have one scheduled in November and December and all next year, once a month, on various topics. So we invite you to call in again sometime. And in the meantime, if you have any questions for us, please contact us. I want to thank Michelle, who's silently in the background, making sure this thing keeps working, the webinar keeps on the rails, and all the folks who support me every day. Thank you all, and thank you again for calling in. We hope to talk to you again sometime or to hear from you in the future if we can help you with any information. Thanks again. Talk to you later. Bye.